God, who reveals himself to us through his written word. Amen. This morning we have the perfect scriptures for the Northwest. They're all full of water. Moses strikes a rock and the water pours forth. Paul tells us that God's love has been poured into us, into our hearts. And of course, Jesus asks for a drink as well. Most of us are lucky to have city water. Maybe not Longview. When we're thirsty, we go to the kitchen faucet. It flows freely, or we turn on the hose in the backyard, and there it is. Those who get water from a well sometimes do not feel quite so lucky. When I lived in Kansas City, I had a well, and it was kind of peculiar. I have friends in Woodland whose water comes from a spring, from the side of a hill. And there's a pipe forced into the hill at the source of the water. And the water goes through the pipe and goes into a holding tank, through some more pipes, through filters, into another holding tank, and finally reaches the kitchen faucet. And I can't begin to tell you how often they are out of water. Either the hillside caves in, or the pipe gets full of sediment, or the pipe comes out. They don't consider themselves lucky at all. Their access to water some days is rather tenuous. Even in other parts of the country, Los Angeles, Arizona, and Colorado fight over water rights to the Colorado River. Many parts of our country have experienced severe drought in the Midwest and the Southeast. But every living creature needs water, from the biggest elephant down to the smallest bacteria and virus. Here in the Northwest, we don't much fear for lack of water. Sometimes we fear because we have too much. But this is not the problem in the Middle East. Water is a commodity in the desert. Travelers there need to know, where are the towns that have a well? And in the desert itself, where are the oases? Both the traveler and their animals can only go so far without replenishment. Jesus and his disciples in this story were in the same boat, so to speak, but without water. Jesus had been in Jerusalem clearing out the temple, and last week you might remember he was confronting Nicodemus about how to be born again, which Nicodemus just didn't get for a good while. And then Jesus decided to return to Galilee. Now, geographically, we have Jerusalem in the south. Just north of Judea, in which Jerusalem resides, is Samaria, and north of that is Galilee. So travelers either went through Samaria, but many of them chose not to, because the Jews and the Samaritans weren't on the best of terms. And so they would go east and up through the Jordan River Valley to get to Galilee and back down. But for some reason, no, Jesus chose to go through Samaria. And here's where we need to take a brief look at history of this area. Around 700 BC, the Israelites were conquered again and were absolutely put into exile. So they were removed from the northern part of Israel, and that is Samaria. And when the Israelites were removed, the Assyrian king brought in non-Jewish peoples to settle those cities. It's also a great trade route. And so the Assyrian king wanted to make sure the trade continued. But when the Jewish people returned, they were really miffed, and the Samaritans wanted to help them rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And the Israelites said, no, do not help us, because they considered the Samaritans to be pagan. And so there's this ongoing chasm between Israel and Samaria. And yet, history will show that the Samaritans were some of the earliest Christians, perhaps because of this incident that's recorded. So let's go back to our gospel story. On the way to Galilee, Jesus and his disciples are going through Samaria. And it's about noon. It's probably hot. So Jesus sends his disciples off, go get some food, get some lunch. And he's weary, so he sits down on the edge of the well. Now, it's curious to know that neither Muslim, Christian, or Jew disputes that this is indeed Jacob's well, and it's still there. You can go visit it. I found on a neat website a whole story of this woman who was on a tour, and she talked about getting down to Jacob's well. And that it's like, it used to be 140 feet deep, a really deep, lovely well. And it is fed by spring water. And at that time, a well that was fed by spring water was called living water, because spring water is always moving, as opposed to a cistern where the water sits there and gets stagnant. And so we're going to see Jesus use this term living water in a very different way. So he's sitting on the well, on the little curb of the well, and here comes a Samaritan, and a woman no less. Convention definitely said a Jew does not speak to a Samaritan, much less an unaccompanied woman. Has Jesus ever been conventional? No. So he addresses her and asks for a drink of water. He could get one himself, but he doesn't. Even she knows he's not supposed to address her and tells him so. Doesn't stop him. From here on, we have this interesting conversation where Jesus, coming from his right brain, is talking about living water that will always quench your thirst, talking about the eternal love of God. And she's coming from her left brain saying, you know, it'd really be neat to have this living water, because then I wouldn't have to come back to this well every day. Then Jesus tells her to go and get her husband. And she's kind of cagey and says, I don't have one. He could confront her right here, but he's very gentle. And he said, you're right, you don't. You had 5. The one you're living with now is not a husband. And he repeats again, what you have just said is quite true. He gives her validation. And the woman's shocked. How could this person know about her past? He's a stranger. But he didn't reject her. And she tells Jesus about the fact that she does believe that the Messiah is coming, that her beliefs are not so different from the Israelites. And yet, Jesus says very simply, and these little revelations are so few in the Bible, I am he. You don't find that very often. Most of the time, he's kind of cagey himself, and he says, who do you think I am? He doesn't admit it. But to her, a Samaritan woman, I am he. He was fully open. Now, of course, we know who he was. We know what he was referring to by living water. But put yourself in her place. Here's someone who's not even supposed to be talking to her. A total stranger who says, I'm the Messiah. Really? What faith it took to believe him, leave her water jar, which meant she was coming back, and go and tell her neighbors and friends. Now seriously, after church, you're out on the corner and someone comes up to you and says, I'm Jesus, I've come here for the second time. What would you do? Pull out the cell phone. Hey, 911, please take this one to St. John's. He's delusional. She didn't think that. Just accepted it. You must be a prophet. You've known everything that I've done. Wow. What was she really thought of in her community? Why did he pick her out? Somehow he seems drawn to people who are different, who need him. Who knows what she was thought of? Her history was more like Elizabeth Taylor. Was she judged? You know? In some ways, was she a nobody? someone to be shunned. Yet it's like Jesus to approach her. He didn't seek out the leaders in the city. He didn't go there and say, "Here I am." He came to her. And it's kind of amazing that he would go to the lowliest citizen in the vicinity, and yet she would get people to believe her. With this gentle interchange, she's converted. Goes and tells her neighbors and friends, kind of wondering aloud, do you really think it's him? Because if she were to go and say, "I found him," they'd probably think the same thing. She's delusional. But come and hear him. Come and see. Doesn't that sound familiar? Come and see. That's the way he called some of his apostles, and they would tell their friends, and come and see. If we were in her place, would we do the same? Actually, this story should give hope to everybody. Before we came to know Christ, some of us might have been like her, kind of marginalized maybe, confused, at times fragile, looking for acceptance and love, and finding it in all the wrong places. Jesus doesn't care about the past, only the present and the future. The past is done. And so that brings us to the question, what are we going to do now and tomorrow? What will we do when we meet someone we don't know? Will we cross that conventional line and speak to them? Will we ignore their past and their present circumstances and treat them as a person worthy of our attention? Is that easy? I don't think so. We grew up saying, "Don't speak to strangers." We grew up being told strangers have a hidden agenda and might harm us. Some of us might even have learned not to accept people who were different. Maybe we didn't learn to approach people with love. Maybe we didn't learn that we could teach people about that living water and quenching their thirst. But luckily, I truly believe all dogs can learn new tricks. I can change what I've learned because I've learned about and experienced God's love for me, and I'm certainly not perfect. And I think it's time to spread that love. And so, I'm going to return to the water. We can have a wonderful water view. It's usually kind of desirable but expensive. We can cross over the water, as I crossed over the Cowlitz River Bridge this morning. We can go under the water in a tunnel. Or we can go on the water in a boat, surfing, water skiing. But the real adventure begins when you get in the water. Are you ready to jump into the living water?